This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 463, Drupal versus DIY site builders. On today's show, we're talking about DIY site building, what the benefits are over Drupal if there are any, and when using Drupal makes sense with our guest, Ivan Stegic. We'll also cover Drupal 11 as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Ivan. He is the CEO of 10.7, a digital agency that builds, rescues, and cares for Drupal sites, and their mission is to make things that matter. He lives in Minneapolis with his wife, kids, and 2 dogs, and is a huge Minnesota Twins fan and a relentless ambassador for technology, science, and common sense, as well as being an eternal optimist. Ivan, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick, John, Martin, Josh. Nice to see you all.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder of Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Josh Miller, Director of Web Development at Urban Institute. Welcome back.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be back.
And also joining us as usual, John Picozzi, Solution Architect at EPAM.
Hello, and funny, 2 things. One, I watched the episode that I was on vacation for at least the first 5 minutes of it, to the point where Martin used my common tagline. So I appreciate that call out, shout out there, Martin. 2, Ivan, how are the Twins doing?
They're doing okay. They're not at the very top of the league, but there's still another 2 months left of the season, and I'm hoping for an October miracle. So
there you go. Still baseball to be played. I love it.
Yes.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you been wanting a version of Drupal that can use workspaces, recipes, and single directory components while running all the latest versions of its underlying technologies? Drupal 11 is all of that and more. It was tagged on August 2nd by a catch of tag 1 and 3rd and Grove, and it, by design, has sort of limited additional features if you're comparing it to something like Drupal 10.3 that was released really about a month ago. By design to sort of make that transition from Drupal 10 to 11 easier. Now, that said, I'm pretty sure there are a variety of improvements, particularly in things like the recipes API, considering that it is sort of an experimental API, and also changes to the recipes API shouldn't have any impact on sites that have already applied recipes. That being said, we can compare some of the features that are built into Drupal 11 to what some people might be familiar with from like the initial release of Drupal 10. So certainly workspaces is a really huge feature, and I think an exciting improvement in sort of modern Drupal. I know you don't like that, Ivan, or Ivan. Revisions and workflow are also now possible for in the UI for blocks and taxonomy terms. And there are also a variety of UI updates for creating and reusing fields, as well as for making bulk content operations. There's also a new access policy API, as well as single directory components. And there are also new navigation and announcements feeds module, as well as a variety of sort of smaller improvements for things like performance, overall usability, developer experience, and more. There is also, in terms of contrib support for Drupal 11, already about 2/3 of the top 200 modules already support Drupal 11. And then if you expand that to include modules that Rector estimates will only need info.yaml or automated bug fixes, that brings us to over 80% of the top 200, or about 75% of all the Drupal 10 compatible projects on Drupal.org, which is a pretty massive figure when you start to think about it. That brings us up to I think somewhere over 7,000 different modules that are basically usable on Drupal 11 already. In terms of the updated dependencies, Drupal 11 requires PHP 8.3, uses Symfony 7.1, CKEditor 42.0.2, Twig 3.9, Yarn 4, modern versions of jQuery, jQuery UI, and a variety of others. Drupal 11 also further extends that initiative of smaller core by moving a number of modules out into the contrib space. So Actions UI, Activity Tracker, Book, Forum, Statistics, and Tour. And it's also worth adding that Drupal 10 will continue to receive maintenance support until mid-2026. So the community created this version of Drupal 11 early to give sites as much time as possible to make the transition. In this case, almost 2 years, which when you think about it is, almost twice the amount of, runway that Drupal 9 sites had to get updated to Drupal 10. So let's talk about Drupal 11.
And Martin, thank you for letting me know that I don't have to upgrade my Drupal 10 site until January or February of 2026. That's perfect.
I feel like you should just go ahead and do it. Go for it.
I don't worry.
I think that was facetious of you.
I'm going to, but I know that there are some folks in the community that like to wait until the last minute. So I was actually very interested at how fast workspaces kind of got stable and got into Drupal, because admittedly the last time I used workspaces, which may or may not have been about a year ago now, maybe a little longer, it had some issues. So happy to see that it's made it into Drupal core. I look forward to seeing more people being able to use that and to kind of see use cases for that and discussions about it, because I think that's an interesting feature.
I agree. And I know there is a project called Workspaces Extra. I think it was mentioned on the show a few episodes back. But hopefully, with it being stable, as you say, more people will start to use it, and we'll start to see a little bit more of an ecosystem grow up around it as well.
I think it's always an interesting conversation briefly to talk about the fact that we really need to get rid of versioning. This is now the latest version of Drupal. And if you're on Drupal 10, you're on an old version of Drupal. And I believe, thank you, Ivan, because I believe, Ivan, you care deeply about this too, right?
Yes, sir. Keep talking. Say more.
We'll put a link in the show notes to our episode on this topic.
Yeah, there's a whole episode on this, and there probably should be more, because honestly, we want to get so comfortable with these upgrades and these deprecations that it's just part of a typical release cycle. Like every twice a year, you're just updating your site. And we have 20 Drupal sites at Urban Institute. And there's currently only 2 that are on Drupal 7, and everything else is on the latest version of Drupal 10 as of 6 months ago. We're all 10.2 or 10.1, 10.2. But once we hit 10.3, which is not a significant change from 10.3 to 11, it's basically the same, just the latest release. And just with deprecation and some updates. And there's always a little bit of growing pains there to go to a new major version, but I'm actually already looking forward to 11.1 to see some of this new stuff really start to take off. But anyway, I find it fascinating with the version numbers.
I do too. And I was just about to say that we are now experimenting with actually putting in our contracts major version updates as just part of the deal. So starting in January, if you're a 10.7 client, and there's a major version update, we're not going to charge you extra. We're not going to have a capital expenditure. It's just going to be part of the regular set of updates. That's my hope as the CEO. That's my goal. We'll see how the next 6 months evolve with how 11 rolls out, with the kinds of things that we see. But that's where I want to get to for 2025.
So I want to take a minute to dig into that just a second, right? Sure. So the goal there is that, like, you have a standard maintenance agreement with a client, and upgrading to new versions of Drupal is just kind of like standard practice, right? And I'm assuming there would be like a change order or maybe some additional cost if there was some custom bits of a customer's code that needed to be updated to be part of that, or to be useful on that version. Is that the thinking?
Yes. So our 10.7 care contracts right now include updates to the latest major version that you're on. So if you're on 10, we'll make sure you're on 10.1, 10.2, 10.3. Those are zero cost except for the maintenance contract. My hope is that I can add to that and have it not mention version It's just the latest major version, and there's no additional expenditure. We had to have additional expenditure for upgrades from Drupal 8 to Drupal 10, but I mean that's the way the cookie crumbles. But from next year onwards, my hope is that it's just Drupal. It's the latest version, no additional expenditure needed. If there's custom code, yes, there's always some edge case somewhere. But if we've been maintaining the site for the last 3-5 years, that custom code isn't even going to be an issue really going from 10 to 11. Honestly, like it's not a 7 to 8 or an 8 to 11. Like it's 10 to 11.
Yeah, and you can build in hours for that into the maintenance agreement, right? So the
Of course.
other thing here I wanna highlight is smaller core, because I'm a huge fan of smaller core, right? Wondering how anybody feels about that list of modules. I'll say it again just so everybody remembers: Action UI, Activity Tracker, Book, Forum, Statistics, Tour, going into the contrib space. Like,
Book.
to me, I'm kind of like, bye. See you guys
Huge
later.
success. Book
fine.
was always such a big challenge for people to maintain in core, and it could have been so much more outside of core. I feel like almost every one of these modules has a better alternative in contrib, or if it doesn't, it should. Like Forum probably doesn't have a good alternative that I'm aware of, but that for the concept of Forum, I would love to see comments do this too, but I don't know if that'll ever happen. But the concept of Forum and Statistics and Tour, I just feel lives better out in contrib space, where it could iterate even further, or potentially not iterate and have lived its life well. But most of these are like classic modules, like been there since the very beginning.
It's funny. I'm like thinking now about like, well, should comment be a contrib module? I'm like, could that come out of core? And then I'm like, well, blog posts, some cases still need comments.
But think about it. If you're implementing comments nowadays, do you use the comment module, or do you use a service?
I mean, I usually advise to use a service, but I mean, I can see a use case. I can see a use case for using core comments.
Well, we dropped comments on the Talking Drupal website when we upgraded to Drupal 10, because we had 450,000 unmoderated comments on the Drupal 7 site.
Wow.
We didn't realize.
But let's be realistic here. That was more because we might not have had the proper process or the proper precautions in place to support that, right? But like, I think there is a place where if you have a blog and commenting is a thing that you need to do, like having that functionality in core seems a little bit easier than having to go like find it and implement it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it'll be interesting to see. I know one of the work tracks for Starshot is to have sort of a more modern blog set up. And it'll be interesting to see whether, core comments are part of that. If so, what security measures do they have? Or do they look at more of an integration with some kind of a third-party service? So
I will say, Martin, you raise, whether you intended to or not, you raise an interesting thought there, right? Is that we may start to see a shift to more smaller core and more things being shipped out of core with the advent of recipes, right? Because if I'm like, oh, I need a blog, and I go to implement the blog recipe, and the blog recipe includes comments, and it pulls it from a contrib space as opposed to a core space, like, I'm not going to really care, right? I'm going to have commenting, and I'm going to have commenting the way that, the Drupal community feels like it should be. So, I think we may see in future versions more things going out to the contrib space, and recipes just being like, I could see a day where, there's a recipe installer, right? And you just hit the button and it installs the recipe and gets all the stuff from wherever, right? So the idea of like core could be very different.
There is a recipe installer today, John. It's called Project Browser.
As soon as I said that, I was like, somebody's going to have something to say here because I'm pretty sure that this already exists. So,
Yeah.
Martin, thank you for that correction. And yes, Project Browser does now support recipes, as Martin indicated, which is fabulous.
So, Martin, if our listeners wanted to suggest a module of the week or a core upgrade of their own, what would be the best way for them to do that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
All right. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks all.
Okay, so we can finally get to our primary topic. Ivan, if we were going to start with a definition, can you let our listeners know what we're calling a DIY site builder?
That's a great question, and I'm so appreciative that this is the very first part of the discussion. Let's define what we mean by DIY site builders. I would say that a DIY site builder is something you can use to build a website using a browser. That's the simplest definition for me. So
you don't count Dreamweaver?
Oh,
wow. Hey, man. There are actually clients out there that still have Dreamweaver and are still using it. Adobe is taking those license payments every month. So don't joke.
I'm going back in my mental Rolodex to the days in which I did manage sites with Dreamweaver, and I'm wondering how that process would hold up today. And whew, all right.
Let's just say
are we not going to mention some examples of these kinds of DIY site builders?
I was just waiting.
Absolutely.
I was waiting.
I was going to talk about examples, but I didn't want to pollute the whole environment by just spitting out, you know what? It's just like Wix. I wanted to just say it's a way of building a website using a browser. So examples, Wix. So these may be good or bad examples. Wix, Squarespace, Shopify, what other ones can you think of? Maybe Drupal Gardens from long ago.
Webflow. There's like
Webflow.
Webflow. That's it.
Also some version of WordPress, right? There's
WordPress VIP, or is that what it's called?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you might be right. I think the other aspect here, right, is like when we say DIY site builder, like there's some combination, right, of site builder platform and hosting all in one, right? Where like you can go as you said, Ivan, like with your browser and type in some stuff into a website and start building your website, right?
And it generally includes the ability to style, layout, add images, add content. It's not, although I suppose like WordPress.com, creating your own blog where you're just entering content only, not really styling, might count. But nowadays, I think generally a DIY web also considers theming.
Yeah.
And design.
I would agree with that.
And I think if you're armed with a browser and a credit card and you're out to build a website, there has to be some focus on the whole package from an infrastructure perspective, from a hosting perspective. Like none of that means anything to anyone who's not technologically savvy at all. And so they just want to be able to build that site and put it out there. And it has to be easy. So there's a focus on user experience. And I think that's a significant part of having a successful DIY site builder. That's not Drupal.
I also think there's some sort of requirement around DNS. So if you go to build a website that you want, you're going to want something.com or that site or something. And how are you going to deal with that domain? How are you going to buy that domain and connect it to your site? It feels very technical. I think that one piece alone sometimes sends people that are interested in DIY site building to look for help.
I was rudely going to yell, Josh, when you started talking about DNS. You just going to yell like too technical, right? Because you're absolutely right. Like a lot of these services have that, and I'm gonna kind of link what Ivan said and what you just said together, right? Because a lot of these services have that domain registration DNS configuration built into the UI where you don't even realize you're doing it, right? You're entering the credit card. You're like, I want, my cool blah, blah, blah website.com. And they go, oh, it's available. Okay. Yep. You're all set. Just put in your credit card and we'll buy it for you. We'll host it for you. And like, you can just move some blocks around a page and like, boom. Hey, you got a website.
And then like 3 weeks later, you end up emailing your friend who does websites. Like, how do I make my email work with this domain that I have?
Well, so
I've gotten a couple of those.
So admittedly, I love Drupal, right? But I set up. I was telling you guys I set up a Squarespace site for my son's baseball club earlier this month, and they actually have interface for email setup. They have integration into Google to use as an email service. They have integration into marketing campaigns and email lists, and it's all right from their their control panel sort of thing. So, I think a lot of these services, depending on what you're looking at, have a lot of those features built in, and they, again, to Yvonne's point, they make it nice and easy for a non-technical user to go in and just kind of push buttons and do things, right? So Yvonne, I know that 10.7 is a Drupal shop, and as you described or as is described in your intro, and as we talked about with the module of the week this week, right? Provide services to Drupal clients, all over the globe, right? I'm wondering, though, does 10.7 use any DIY site builders? Do you guys have kind of experience with your clients and using some of these solutions?
We actually do. And I'm a big fan of using the right tools for the job and making sure that we can service a client that wants to be with 10.7 in a way that's most beneficial for them. So we had a client that was on Drupal 7, had an expansive commerce site that was on Drupal Commerce, and Drupal 7 was running out of time, right? So we needed to migrate them to something else. And we did the evaluation. Okay, what is it going to take to rebuild all of the stuff that we built in 2011 using Commerce when it first came out in Drupal 10? Kind of expensive. It's kind of out of the box, off the shelf stuff now with Shopify. Like, Ted, let's just rebuild this for you in Shopify. And so we did that, and we did the migration, and we launched him on Shopify, and he, cost him less in maintenance. We lost a client because, not Drupal. That's what we specialize in, but it was the right thing to do. And so when I'm not a fan of being headstrong in Drupal at all costs, because I don't think it's right for everyone. And so, yes, we have experience with Shopify. On the other hand, we don't seek out Shopify business because we know that that's not our core strength. We have experience with Squarespace as well. We have experience with Wix as well. And to what you were saying earlier, I think it was in the pre-show, it's not the best platform. And so we see people leaving Wix and coming to Drupal, actually. And yeah, I mean, it's not hard to be experienced and well-versed in something like Wix and Squarespace.
Ivan, I've worked at a number of agencies over the years. One of them is Acro. Used to be called Acro Media, Acro Commerce, I think is what it's called now. They did a lot of Drupal commerce work over the years, and I was on a lot of sales calls at Acro Media when I worked there, and that was usually one of the first things we would try to do is assess and discover, is Drupal even the right tool? Because it's not often the right tool. It's down to budget primarily, because Drupal is more like a a box of Legos that you can produce almost anything with, but you have to have a good plan in place, a good understanding of what you need to do. And generally speaking, I like the way you put this. There's nothing they were trying to do that wasn't Shopify. So why wouldn't you use Shopify? And that we lost is maybe the wrong words. We helped people understand their needs at Acromedia and pushed them to solutions that would make more sense for them, for their particular commerce requirements. And it wasn't a huge percentage. It was maybe 20% of the kind of sales calls that I was on that we dealt with that, but it was big enough that it happened pretty frequently.
Yeah, and I think when we were defining what a DIY site builder was, like we kind of left Shopify out, but I definitely think Shopify is a player in this game, especially if you need to do e-commerce, right? Squarespace does offer e-commerce functionality, donation functionality, but I think like if you're looking full-fledged soup to nuts e-commerce, right, Shopify is the kind of the incumbent.
Especially with real world transactions as well, where I think Drupal commerce, I haven't looked at the details of how it's evolved, but I can't imagine that there are devices that you can just use and they work natively with Drupal commerce, right? And Shopify has that stuff, and that's important to a lot of small businesses.
There's we're using these site builders, or we're recommending them sometimes. And I'm curious, I personally also have a Squarespace blog, because I frankly don't think Drupal is that great at blogging unless you want to spend time on lots of technical things. And I'm curious, Ivan, if you feel like there's something specific that site builders are doing better than Drupal. And hopefully we can dig a little deeper than just the user experience feels better. But we have paragraphs. There's a lot of user experience that we're working on in the Drupal world.
DIY site builders are product companies that are focused on their users and focused on converting them to paying clients. And as a result, their user experience must be competitive. They must have a clear message. They must have clear marketing, and they have to make their value proposition immediately obvious. And unfortunately, that means that it's a race to the bottom from a cost perspective, because effectively your user experience on a Squarespace and a Shopify are kind of the same. The cost is about the same. You're really looking at feature differentiation at that point. And so you kind of have to expect that from a for-profit company that is driven by revenue. And so, yes, UX is the answer to the question, but I don't think we're getting it right 100% of the time in Drupal. And yes, we have Layout Builder and paragraphs, and we have Starshot, and we have ways of assembling all of these things so that the user experience is the best it can possibly be. But it's not solely focused on the user and on a profit motivation, because ultimately we're not a for-profit. So like we don't have that kind of direction and that kind of motivation, and that's totally fine. But there's definitely something we could learn from that whole focus on the user and focus on that exceptional experience.
So I think the phrase that Ivan just used, the race to the bottom, is kind of the catalyst for this whole episode, right? That's where months ago, that's where it started. He used that term, and I was like, wait a second. But in what he just said, right? Like, I think there's a great amount of value there, right? And for me, I take a little bit of a different spin on it. I don't think it's necessarily, well, I think it is about price. And, I think next question, we're going to talk more about price, but like, I also think it's about how we frame it, right? So when you look at a DIY site builder, you're looking at ease of use, right? You're looking at, that non-technical user being able to do what they want to do, right? And all of us on this call know that when you start to use Drupal, right, you have to have some development knowledge in order to make that a reality, right? In order to make that work, right? That those aspects have been removed here from a lot of these solutions, right? Now, yes, if you get into the nuts and bolts of Squarespace, and I'm sure Shopify, and you want to, do weird or interesting things with your DNS or with your code, right? You have the ability to do some of those things, but they're not like a prerequisite, right? And I think that's kind of where we get hung up, and maybe we get a little bit of a bad rap compared to some of these other solutions in the Drupal space, is that there's kind of like that technical prerequisite in order to use the platform.
And it's not down to the just understanding the technical side of things. I think it's we mentioned earlier, it's design as well. There's something about this race to the bottom that you want that flash and that pizzazz, or like my advertising 101 class in college called you want to sell the sizzle and not the steak. And I feel like what people see about like well done website experiences, they want to produce for their whatever community project, and if they can click it together very quickly and make it look nice, like they maybe spent more time on it than they initially thought they would need to, then that's a huge win. And those design services, Ivan, when you are potentially working with a client who needs to move over to one of these platforms, I imagine there's no part of your agency that's doing any kind of real design work there, right? Like you're just picking a template and maybe changing some colors.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's not even a team that would do the work. It's one person that we know has general skills and is able to put it together from beginning to end. And that person has design acumen, and maybe some development acumen, but is not a developer. And so it's almost an administrative, content-focused design exercise, as opposed to a fully featured development exercise, which is kind of our bread and butter, right? Like 90% of the work we do, 95.
That conversation with the client is a lot smaller and shorter too, because you're like, hey, we're using Squarespace, and here are all of the themes available. Go through, pick the one that you love, and that's the one we're going to implement, right? So it's a lot less about like, okay, here's some design mocks, like tell us what you think, and like, it's more like, oh, you picked this theme, okay, now maybe we do a design mock just to show you what the page could look like, right? But ultimately, it's a shorter conversation.
So I think this is a very important thing you just said, and here's the reason why. You are differentiating between a smaller, simpler, less complex site that has best practices UX already implemented through these themes that have been thought through, and potentially a more complex site that has a different integration. Maybe the user audiences are more complex or have divergent needs. And that kind of stuff isn't going to be well supported on a Squarespace. So I think what you just maybe inadvertently defined was simpler clients with fewer needs and less complexity, and then another group of clients that are more complex, another group of sites that have higher demands. And I think that our industry has evolved. I think Drupal used to play in all of those fields and could successfully do that in all of those fields. And I think as a product and as a community, that's changed, because WordPress or Squarespace and Shopify didn't exist a while ago. Now they exist. And so if we want to play in that space, we then have to be a part of the race to the bottom. And an agency like mine is not going to be able to do that, because I can't support a client on $200 a month to maintain their website, and Squarespace can. And so I think that we've moved, we've evolved, we've grown up.
So
you can still do it if you want to, but it's not likely going to happen in the most.
So I think to put a finer point on something you just said, right? You talk about like a simple website versus a more complex website. I actually would say that a lot of these DIY site builders are getting better at doing more complex things, right? Blogs, e-commerce, social media integrations, marketing email list signups, calendar of events, those sorts of things, right? But where they are not going to be able to support you potentially, right, is with those more custom integrations into your specific business use case, right?
Yes.
Oh, I have a ERP system that I need to integrate my website into. That's going to be an area where like, nope, might not be able to do that, right? Or might have to get creative with how to do that. So I think that's definitely a differentiator in what you just said.
So I'm a little bit curious about the other way, because I think sometimes people are in Drupal and it makes sense to go to a more server-based system like we've been talking about. But the opposite is true as well. I've certainly had clients that started out with Wix and they built up their platform, their business grew, or they started with Shopify, and Shopify does have a development, I forget what they call it, but they have a marketplace where you can develop custom functionality, but you're kind of limited what you can do there. And if you truly need custom functionality, you kind of can't do it. I'm curious about the use cases, Ivan, that you've had that started on one of these site builder platforms and moved to Drupal. What are the characteristics of those types of projects that might tell somebody, if they're listening, hey, maybe it's time to contact an agency and move off of something like Wix?
Complexity. In one word, that's the answer. And perhaps time to market is a second part of that answer. We have an existing client that's been with us for less than half a year, but they started out on Wix, and did so during COVID because they needed time to market. They need fast time to market. They needed cheap. They needed to do this themselves. They needed to not have to write an RFP. And it was COVID, right? Like, do whatever you need to do to get the thing done. And they have been on Wix for a couple years now, 3 years. And they've simply added so many manual processes to their organization as a result of not being able to do the complexity, to do the automation on that Wix platform, because it's only going to do this and this and this. And now how do I add an access code that's custom? And like, oh, okay, well, I can't. So I'm going to just have to manually maintain that in a spreadsheet and teach everyone how to use that, right? Like that.
Yeah.
So they grew out of that, and then they decided to move to Drupal with an RFP. That didn't actually go so well because they weren't able to quantify exactly what they wanted. And so the first migration had to stop. They had to stop the first migration, at which point we were introduced to them, and we kind of said, okay, just a sec, let's evaluate Wix and see if it's actually appropriate for you or not, to give them the peace of mind of like, are we leaving this behind, or is it just a bad configuration, or is Drupal something that we could use to replace it as they had originally intended? And we landed on, yeah, Drupal is going to do all the things you say you need it to do. And so we've taken a very careful, planful approach of moving from Wix to Drupal. Some of the first things that we've done is improve the accessibility on the platform that they already have. You would imagine that a company like Squarespace, who makes squarespace.com, would have attention to accessibility. You would imagine that Wix would do the same thing. Our experience has not been great. And so, yes, it's easy. Yes, it's fast. Yes, it's cheap. Yes, the UX is designed to, suck you in and buy it. but does it have all of the properties that we expect? For the most part, Squarespace seems to be pretty good. Shopify seems to be pretty good. My personal experience in Wix has not been so great. So even though these companies are, competing on the race to the bottom, they might not actually have the exact same product once you buy. And that, I think, is another differentiator for us, right? We are solely community-based, nonprofit. Like, we think accessibility is important. We have that right out of the box, and we can point to that.
Yeah, I think I agree mostly. Accessibility is a big one. I think there's a few other use cases that I find that very quickly move out of those systems. Another one is translation, right?
Oh,
if you
yes.
want great translation and actual translations, Drupal is definitely the way to go. Another one that's pretty big, but I don't hear people talking about too much. If you want to enforce brand principles, you can't do that on Wix, because people that have permission on Wix can change. They can be like, you know what? I don't like that font. So the page that I maintain is going to use Helvetica and this purple that I really like. And
Squarespace does that too. You can even change the logo on every particular page if that's
Yeah.
what
Oh, you
want to
can?
do.
Oh,
On
really?
Squarespace, just
Every
shoot me
page
now.
could be
Yeah.
a special snowflake.
Yep.
yeah, so there use cases like that. But on the flip side, if you decide we want to change our brand color, and sometimes it's really difficult to do that in Squarespace because you have to find every single override now and change those. Now you can do that in Drupal too. You can build a system where there's override upon override upon override, and updating a style or something can be painful. But if you're using best practices and single directory components and those kinds of things, swapping out one accordion for another or one font for another theoretically is as simple as just changing it in one or two places. I mean, reality is often more complex than that, but you don't have the added, you generally don't have the added complexity of, okay, we have every single editor can make changes of their own on their own site. I think
Yeah.
Starshot's going to introduce some of that, so we'll see what happens in a couple of years. But that's definitely one of the issues top of mind for the Starshot team, and it just doesn't really exist for brand identity doesn't really exist as a strong form for a lot of these builders. And I'll say the last thing that I think drives you out of it, if your use case, and this kind of goes to your complexity point, Ivan, if your use case steps outside of their expected market even just a little bit, you're in trouble.
It's not for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Shopify, one of the biggest e-commerce sites I worked on, started on Shopify, but they sold used luxury goods. And so they had, generally, every time they had a SKU, it was one SKU. Because even if they had two of the same shirt, one of them might have a little bit more wear than the other. So it would have a different price. It would have different pictures. Like, basically every item that they sold was unique. And Shopify was crushing under the weight of the amount of SKUs that they were creating. And so they went to a custom solution, because you can build that type of thing, that type of logic that you need in a custom solution, and you can't get Shopify to bend to your will unless you're an enormous company and willing to spend orders of magnitude more money than you would spend to build a custom. You're not going to get Shopify to change their use case for you.
So, I mean, I think that's a differentiator, right? And that's kind of what I think Ivan and Nick are saying the same thing here, right? So it's like, it's not only about like, does the feature set of the DIY site builder fit your needs, right? But it's also like, do you have, enterprise level requirements that you need to meet? So, in Nick's example, Squarespace does allow you to set kind of a master theme with master colors and change those colors that applies to your whole site, but it may not have page level permissions to say, oh, they can only change these text fields and not change the, these theme colors or this picture or so on and so forth. Right. So, I mean, I think that's part of your evaluation of the the DIY solution to determine whether it's going to fit your use case. It's interesting because when Ivan first started talking, he talked about faster time to market, and I automatically was like, he's not going to try to tell me that Drupal provides faster time to market, because I'm like, has nobody ever said, hey, if we build a Drupal site, you'll have faster time to market? And he didn't say that. He framed it correctly. Yeah. So, I think that's another aspect here too, that if you're like, I need to have a website live, by the end of the week, like, okay, that might be a use case to pick a DIY solution. Right. But
that being said, though, you sorry to interrupt. That being said, you can, once you have a Drupal system in place, for specific tasks, you can have a faster time to market, right? If you have a really complex, if you have like a really complex, to what Ivan was saying, like if you have like tons of manual processes that you have to run to get something properly up on Wix, and there's steps that are constantly missed or skipped or forgotten, and you have to go back and like sometimes those added processes can make launching a new product or something significantly slower than if you have a lot of those processes automated in a way that notifications are handled in Drupal. Yeah, the initial build out is going to be more complex in Drupal, but the long-term maintenance and deployment strategy can be significantly faster in Drupal once you tailor it.
Like that's yes, I agree with you 100%. Like, you can, as somebody who's been working on a platform for websites built in Drupal for the last couple of years, like, yes, you can absolutely get time to market down to be something that is comparable with a DIY solution, right? If you plan for it from the get-go. But there's significant cost that goes into that, and there's significant time that goes into that, right? And I think the point there was like, faster time to market is like, how fast can I put up a website? I can put it up pretty quick with some of these DIY solutions. Nick, something that you finished your previous comment with, and that I want to dig into a little bit here, is Starshot, right? So we've, obviously the Drupal world is all abuzz with Starshot and how it is going to be amazing, and it is going to provide a cleaner, easier path to Drupal adoption, right? My question, and part of what I was thinking about in the Dries note when Dries announced Starshot was, Drupal and its ability to combat kind of a DIY site builder like Squarespace, right? So, Ivan, because you're you and you have an agency, and you're kind of in this space and talking to the people on the ground, so to speak. Do you think that Starshot, once it's done and available and ready to use, could be positioned to combat some of these DIY site builders?
Sure, but where's the platform that runs it and the company that sells it, and where's the infrastructure needed to really compete? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have that, you're not competing. You have a product that's not being used by anyone, and you ultimately need an agency like 10-7 to implement it for you. Yep. So like, I don't know that we want to compete. Like, maybe that's the thing. Maybe we don't want to compete with the self-service Squarespaces of the world. Maybe we want to use what they have to inspire us to have the best possible experience in Drupal, so that agencies or freelancers or single person shops can implement it and be competitive with a Squarespace.
I have a very strong point of view on this, which I don't know, I've shared a little bit. I will get on my soapbox and share it now, right? I personally think that Starshot should be a DIY site builder competitor, right? I think that there should be some sort of infrastructure built around Starshot to be able to provide not the same level of service as Squarespace, but a reasonable Drupal reasonable version that could position Drupal in the same sort of light as one of these DIY solutions, right? And the reason I think this is because we're gonna get to the end of Starshot, right? Or we're going to get to a version 1 MVP of Starshot, whatever you want to call it.
Don't even start.
Whatever you want to call it, right? Like Starshot's going to be out in the world.
We're not going to version it.
No. Well, yeah. Okay, fair. Retract my previous versioning statement, but like Starshot's going to be out, right? And ready for people to use. And to Ivan's point, they're still going to need an agency to implement it. Now, Matt Glaman is doing some work where you can spin up Starshot in your browser. You don't even need hosting. It's very interesting to me. I love Matt. I love the effort that he puts in, but whenever I hear that, or, I even saw a demo of it a couple of weeks ago, I was like, this is still super developer like heavy, right? You need to, it works in your browser. Perfect. But like, if you want to host it, you want to point a domain to it, you want to do that next step, like you have to figure out how to export it. You have to figure out how to do all of these kind of things, right? My point of view, hold on, Ivan, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, no worries, but like my point of view here is that like for us to be able to get to the next level of Drupal, for us to be able to actualize and realize all the benefits of Starshot, there has to be some sort of, and I'm going to come right out and say it, Squarespace competitor, right, that uses Drupal Starshot, that makes it easy. Again, going to Ivan's first point, with UI and all of that stuff to install, set a domain up, and get a Drupal site like up and running with Starshot, right? And once we have that, like think of all the great things that can happen. And I'm not saying that this platform has to be fully functional, fully actualized, right? You don't have to be able to do 100 million different things with it, right? But it's a gateway into the Drupal community. Imagine if we could take half of the Squarespace users or a quarter of the Squarespace users and convert them into Drupal users with this very simple version of Starshot, right? This very simple implementation infrastructure of Starshot, right? They're now Drupal users. They're now using it, and maybe, they get to the edges of it and they go, hey, I'm going to reach out to 10.7, or I'm going to reach out to EPAM, or I'm going to reach out to Nick, right? And I need him to, build another feature on top of what I already have, or expand those borders, right? It provides an entry point into the Drupal community. It provides an entry point into, providing more business opportunity, for Drupal agencies and Drupal companies, right? Like, and it increases our adoption, right? So I'm going to get off my soapbox now, my Starbucks. That's funny. That's a funny slip, but I'm going to get off my soapbox now and let you guys continue. But like, I think like we gotta figure out how to get there.
Well, I have a question that's going to bring it back around to Ivan really quick. Ivan, you guys at your agency, you guys use Pantheon. Am I correct in that?
Yep.
Okay. So here's a question, and I think it kind of hits at this intersection that you were saying, Ivan. Like you don't think Drupal necessarily should race to the bottom with all the DIY site builders. John, you think we have to, because we have to increase adoption in Drupal. And I agree. I actually think that what you just described, John, is the purpose of Starshot. It's to open is to open Drupal up to a bigger audience. So my question to you, Ivan, is do you think Pantheon, who I think inevitably will want to build something like John just described, some sort of on-ramp to a Starshot thing, they're probably building it as we speak. Do you feel like Pantheon might be competing with agencies that are building websites?
No, I don't think that's in Pantheon's best interest, and I don't think they're building something like what you described.
Interesting.
And I, I never. So first of all, John, your description of this idea of cannibalizing Squarespace users is genius. Love the idea. I don't think it's the role of the Drupal Association and Drupal to do that, because if it was, we would then turn ourselves into from a nonprofit into a for-profit to have a competitor to do that. So that's one point. The second point is that doesn't mean that there aren't other organizations that are going to do that and that are going to cannibalize that business and that are then going to on-ramp people who start using Drupal unknowingly, maybe in some cases, to bring them into the community. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about Cosmic.build and what they're doing. And like that's literally what I don't know very much about them are doing from what I can tell. It's like, I have a browser and a credit card. I could sign up on Squarespace, but I could go to Cosmic.build and sign that up. That's Drupal, right? But that's a for-profit entity doing stuff. So I don't like, we have to spin off a for-profit entity or have one that we're invested in, and like like people that do that. I don't know, you know, like,
I struggle with the idea that it couldn't be the DA that does it.
Have you met us?
Well,
have you met us?
So here, let me put on my rose-colored glasses for a minute and imagine, you know, how I think this may, I don't know, right? Rose-colored glasses. The DA could have an offering, right? And like I'm saying, it's not full-featured. It's not as, for lack of a better term, robust as a Squarespace, right? But it is and like this idea has been percolating since the launch button in Dries's announcement, right? Like, well, that's where this lives, is like somebody goes to Drupal.org and hits the launch button and they're in a funnel to start like configuring their Starshot site, right?
Can I chime in for a second? Because I think just to give you an idea of the current plan, because there's been discussion about how to handle this, right? And I think the current plan is some combination of the work that Matt is doing, right? So the DA right now, I don't think has any plans to set up a hosting company, right? But they also they don't want to show preference to one, like they're not going to set up the hosting on Pantheon or Platform or Aqua. Like they don't want to show preference to one particular hosting company because they all support the DA. So I think part of the plan is you might start with the WebAssembly, but there's that's more to just like see Drupal installed and click around and do something. Yeah, you can start configuring things. You can start adding things because it is Drupal. But the funnel there is you can then say, I want to make this public now, right? And then part of that is choosing a hosting provider. I think the idea is that you're just like, oh, I want to host it. They show you, okay, if you want to pay $40 a month, it's this one. It's $50 a month. It's this one. $60 a month is that. You pick a plan, you click a button, enter your credit card, and it migrates that into whatever hosting plan you provided, you chose, and you now have a site running.
2 thoughts on that. And like, these are like, I could probably talk about this for another hour, but I know that our listeners would be like, okay, we've heard enough, or like all of us have other things to do, right? 2 points on that. One is, Nick, maybe that's a possibility, maybe, but I will tell you with 100% certainty that it has to be flawless, effortless, and there cannot be any technical, git pull, pick your git repository, hey, go to Acquia and set up like DNS.
It fails if you mention git. It fails if you mention git or command line.
It has to be the best user experience that you've ever seen in your life in order to make that work.
Yeah.
Other aspect here too.
They agree too.
I think that this is why it's a good idea for the DA, is that for years, we've been hearing that the DA needs another revenue stream other than Drupal.org, right? I feel personally, this is John talking.
You mean DrupalCon?
Sorry, what did I say? I said Drupal.org. Yes, I did mean DrupalCon. Thank you, Nick. This is all me. Like, this is just John Picozzi on a podcast talking about this scenario. So, like, I honestly feel that there is a scenario, rose-colored glasses again, where the DA has some sort of offering that solves this problem and provides people with that kind of like gateway into Drupal that does not compete with all of the other vendors, right? And that is a revenue stream for them where they can charge somebody some fee per month, per year, whatever, to be able to have, you know, Josh's blog or WordPress.com. What's that?
Yeah, it's
like WordPress.com. Yeah,
sure.
Like they are not a hosting company, nor do they wish to be, because now they'll be in direct competitive. They will be direct competitors to Pantheon, Acquia, Platform, etc., etc. They will be. Like,
I mean, so like, let's use the power of the Drupal community here. Maybe there's a partnership opportunity right there that I don't know. Like,
or maybe you can address this with like with an organization mindset where you go to all of the, let's say, the top 15 hosting providers with we want you to support Starshot, and here's what a Drupal Association Starshot integration looks like, and it needs to be a baseline price, and it needs to support this technical transition concept, every host that does it.
I'm willing, like, that could be a fine example, right? Like, there's an integration. We need to make it, you know, we need to make it UX friendly, whatever, right?
And maybe the DA gets a percentage for sending that over.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a referral fee. Sure. Like that feels like it could happen. But I think a lot of what you may hear back is that some of the higher, the more prominent Drupal hosting companies don't want to offer, you know, a reduced cost, a cheap, basically, hosting option, right?
They don't want that the race to the bottom either.
So I mean, like, the idea here that it's a competitor, right, is not necessarily 100% accurate, right? So anyway, like, again, this is like very perfect world, right? Where it's like everybody wants to play nice and everybody wants to support the DA because we all have a vested interest in Drupal and the future of Drupal, right? But like, I think I really fundamentally at my core believe that, like, for Starshot to be successful, or to be able to bring new people into the community the way that we wanted to, like, this needs to be on the table. And for all I know, you know, I know Matt's leading an initiative to kind of build out this process. He may already be thinking about this. I haven't necessarily talked to him about that. We are going to try to get a show on, I think, in the future about it. So we will be able to talk about it more. But like, I think we, you know, Ivan hit it on the head there, where it's got to be like UX perfect and very easy and push button.
Yeah, I mean, there's other issues with the process too, right? Just to be clear, like these are some rose-colored glasses, and we're kind of skipping over a lot of logistical and political hurdles that we are aware exist. Like, for example, the cheapest hosting that you can get at a Drupal hosting client is 50, 60, 70 bucks a month.
Almost not true. Not true.
Who's cheaper?
50, 60 a month? No, that's not true. Pantheon's entry-level hosting, if you pay annually, is not as much as 50 a month.
Yeah, I think it's like 200 or 300.
I think you're right, Josh.
Really?
It's basic. Everyone thinks they only have performance plans, but they have a basic plan that's
They
lot
do.
lower.
Yeah.
Or do they just... Okay, 1 second. Let me look this up.
My church uses Pantheon, and I know how much it is because it's really low. It's really low.
$42 a month.
And if you buy it through a reseller like 10.7, we could give you a deal on that too.
Oh.
Actually,
I think
Actually, John-
Josh's church is going to be looking for a favor.
yeah, we never
What were
know.
you- What were you saying?
John, I was going to say, would you like to know what my vision of where we're at 3 years from now is?
Sure. I would love nothing more.
Oh, thank you for saying that. So, in 3 years, I think we're all in my world. This is the ideal situation. We are referring to Drupal as a thing. There's no use of any version numbers in any of our marketing. People know us as the producers of Drupal. Us being the Drupal community, us being the Drupal association. Drupal uses the Drupal framework that anyone could use if they wanted to build a site, or they could just use Drupal because that's the best implementation of the Drupal framework. And you can go to Drupal.org and try out using Drupal because it just runs in your web browser. You don't need to buy any hosting to just check it out. You can try it. And then when you're so happy with what you've built, you can go to the next stage and select between a host of different platforms to host Drupal on, Acquia, Pantheon, Platform, whoever else is there. And when you click on that host, you end up with an account there, and the thing you were trying in your browser just is now magically working with that host you have selected because of the features that you wish to have in a host. And maybe you don't care because you're not technically oriented, but that's where you end up. In the background, that organization is paying the Drupal association for a referral fee, and there is no Starshot, there is no Drupal 11, there's just Drupal that uses Drupal framework, and that's it. How do you like them apples?
It's the Drupal framework, and then you have the option to install the Starshot recipe.
No, there's no Starshot recipe. No.
Yeah.
No, Drupal is the thing that we come up with for Drupal Starshot that is the best possible iteration of ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what Drupal is. And it uses the Drupal framework. And the Drupal framework is what we've been calling Drupal core, Drupal API that's in core, Drupal 11, Drupal 10, whatever you like. It's the underlying fundamentals that if you really wanted to, you could use that and build up the thing that you want to build. But you're using Drupal, and it is a child of Starshot.
Yeah. So this is my last point, and then we got to close because we're actually way over time already.
Sorry.
But no, it's always a pleasure. But just to your point, the plan is never to call it Starshot. Starshot's the initiative, and I think we sometimes forget that. I'm not saying you did, Ivan, in this particular case, but Starshot is just the initiative. They haven't decided what they're going to call the final product. I think it's going to be Drupal. The core piece, I don't think it'll ever be called Drupal Framework just because Symfony Framework exists already, and framework implies something technical. I don't know what they'll call it.
Does it?
Yeah. There's something specific. So I think it's going to be Drupal or Drupal CMS. Like that's going to be the final name of it, and that's what people install. That's what people use and build on top of it. I think you're going to get your wish eventually, Yvonne. I just don't know what they're going to call the core side. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Yvonne. It's always a pleasure to have you on. We always dig into little corners that I never think about, and then I just spend the next 4 weeks wondering about something that I never thought of before. So it's a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. It's always so awesome to talk to you guys, and thank you for listening to my thoughts and rants and passionate ideas. Like, I would love for us to just have a simple life that is able to service our clients in the best possible way. And I think we all want that.
Absolutely. All right. Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and the listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
All right, Ivan, if our listeners want to get in touch with you and have opinions or thoughts, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way to do that is to reach at me at the 107 website, 107.com/Ivan, TEN7.com/IVAN.
And Josh, how about you?
I'm Josh Miller on Drupal.org, Drupal Slack, Mr. Josh Miller on Twitter, and Josh Miller on LinkedIn.
John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.